Good morning, everyone. We're so glad you're here. This is the Literacy for Leaders webinar series. This is our fifth session and our final session in the series. Our topics today will be fluency and comprehension. All of our resources today are linked in the Padlet that's posted on the slide. You can use the bit.ly or the QR code to access the Padlet, and Kelly is also going to be dropping the direct link to the Padlet in the chat bar. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our Office of Early Learning team here today. I'm Candace Heath, and I'm one of the early education consultants in the Southeast region. Presenting with me today is Dr. Angela Preston, representing the Southwest region. Behind the scenes today, helping us man the Q&A, the chat, and the polls are Dr. Donna Albaugh from the Sandhills region, Kelly Pratt from the West region, and Cynthia Barber from the Northwest region. Today we're going to be presenting a large amount of information for you, so you may want to consider using the note catcher to record your thoughts as we go. The note catcher is linked under that section 5 of the Padlet if you follow that link, and it should be a forced copy. So although today's session is focused on fluency and comprehension, if you missed any of the other sessions, those recordings and resources will be linked on that same Padlet as sessions 1, 2, 3, and 4. Those topics were science of reading, phonemic awareness and oral language, phonics, and vocabulary. So let's take a quick look at today's agenda and preview our content for the day. We'll begin with the evidence-based practices for both fluency and comprehension. Then we'll move to effective implementation with our literacy intervention plans. We'll discuss improvement cycles within the enabling context, and we'll end with a guest speaker with perspective from the field. So let's start by seeing who's with us here today in this session. All right, there we go. Here's our poll results. We have a wide range of participants. That's awesome. We have some coaches here. We have school leaders. We have district leaders, a few teachers, and a few others. So welcome. We hope all of you will find parts of this information relevant, if not all of it relevant to your current position. So welcome. All right, so as you might remember from previous webinar sessions, this slide represents the active implementation formula. In our first section of today's webinar, we're going to take a deeper look into what we mean when we say evidence-based practices for both fluency and comprehension, that first part of the active implementation formula. So our first major topic today is fluency. You may recall fluency is one of those big 5 components of reading. In this first section of the presentation, we're going to make connections to Scarborough's reading rope. We're going to discuss key components of fluency, fluency instruction, and also fluency assessments. So let's start by considering where fluency falls within Scarborough's reading rope. The word recognition side at the very bottom, the blue section, represents those sub-skills that we need to become automatic in order for a reader to be fluent. So you'll see the phonological awareness strand, the decoding strand, and that sight recognition strand. Once you have automaticity with all of those skills, fluent reading becomes possible. And also, if you look at the top in the red section, the language comprehension section, language structures that include syntax also support fluency. So even though that is on the language comprehension side of the rope, teaching syntax, those rules of governing how words can be put together in sentences, is going to support phrasing and prosody for students, which also helps to bridge that gap to comprehension. So what is fluency? Fluency is defined in various ways from many different reading experts, but all can agree that fluency should not be defined as just that ability to read faster and faster. So having that clear definition of fluency is going to allow us to understand why fluency is a concern in reading development, and also help us to identify those fluency-based problems in reading and how to address them in instruction. So Jan Hasbrook on this slide describes fluency as reasonably accurate reading at an appropriate rate with suitable prosody that leads to accurate and deep comprehension and a motivation to read. On the next slide, we'll take a moment to watch a brief video from Dr. Jan Hasbrook.
Every teacher, every administrator would now say fluency is important because fluency helps a reader comprehend. The problem is they misunderstand what fluency is, thinking that it has to do with that rate piece. But the reason fluency is vital for comprehension, rate is part of it, but fluency really has three major components, rate being one. But I always talk in my presentations, my workshops, as I will here at the Plain Talk Conference, is the fundamental importance of accuracy. Accuracy is the foundation of fluency. If indeed fluency is vital for comprehension, the main reason is because we need our students to read with sufficient accuracy. That is a part of fluency. It's the foundation. Rate is also part of it though, too, because if a student reads accurately but too slowly, comprehension will be impeded. But a student can read too fast and impair or impede their accuracy. So it's all of a combination of things. The third piece of fluency is what technically is called prosody. A lot of teachers use the term good expression, which is the tone, the rate, the pitch, the fluidity of reading. So all three of those things are important. And that's really my point here, talking to folks about fluency, is to put rate back into perspective, the piece that I've contributed to the knowledge, which is how fast should students be in the grades from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. That's the research work that I've done. It's not irrelevant, it's very important. But the big message is faster is not better. We need our students to read well, not to read fast.
I love that final quote from
Every
Dr.
teacher.
Hasbrook. We need our students to read well, not read fast. I think that is a great explanation of fluency. Dr. Jan Hasbrook is an outstanding science of reading advocate. If you'd like to hear the remaining portion of that video, along with a couple of other videos from Dr. Hasbrook, we have linked those on the Padlet under the Session 5 tab. So you heard Jan Hasbrook mention three critical components of fluency. So let's take a few moments to explore those components more in depth. To develop fluency, students must work on these three components that indicate fluent reading: accuracy, rate, and prosody. These elements are intertwined, so when you work on one element, you often are working simultaneously on another. So for example, if you had an increase in accuracy, you'll probably also improve your reading rate. And likewise, an increase in rate is going to improve your prosody, since students can now pay attention to phrasing and the meaning of the passage rather than just focusing on those decoding of individual words. And fluency is also that characteristic of a skilled reader. So if a student is not fluent, that is a red flag or maybe an indicator that something is going on with those sub-skills needed for skilled reading. So we need to intentionally and explicitly teach accuracy, rate, and prosody. So over the next few slides, we'll review each of those components. So let's start with accuracy. Accuracy is that foundation of fluency. It should always be our first priority. Most fluency screeners are going to set accuracy targets of 95% or higher. And accuracy is important in all that we do in life. So consider what would happen if you inaccurately read a recipe or a map, or maybe even instructions for an assessment. Or maybe consider this basketball analogy. So in order to shoot a layup, there are skills that have to be mastered. A basketball player has to be able to perform a skill without even thinking about those steps involved, such as dribbling or running down the court. So if I'm a basketball player and I want to be really great at layups, I have to master dribbling the basketball, and dribbling while running down the court. So if I pay too much attention to any of those things, such as my dribbling or my running, I'm not going to have any space left to focus on the actual layup. And therefore, my layup would be inferior to someone who actually has mastered that skill of running and dribbling. So similarly in literacy, every time a reader misreads a word or does not decode a word correctly, they lose meaning. So for students to read accurately, they have to develop those skills such as phonemic awareness, letter knowledge, and phonics to mastery and be automatic. If those skills are not mastered, then that accuracy is going to suffer. So now let's talk about rate. Reading rate specifically refers to how quickly and accurately a reader reads a connected text. It's not just the speed that matters, but that accuracy as well. And conversational rate is reading at that pace that we speak. When you combine rate and accuracy, that's when automaticity is achieved. You might remember from our phonics session that orthographic mapping is the mental process that we use to store words for immediate and effortless retrieval. The more we know about a word, the more we're able to read it and spell it accurately, and automatically. And think about the reading brain. If you guys remember the fifth reading brain here, we have pathways that are formed. And these pathways have an extensive circuit that form that automatic retrieval of words. And as automaticity increases, the demands on our working memory decreases, which it will free up that brain to focus on text comprehension. Some people call that freeing up our desk space. The best approach to fluency, though, is to be sure that a student has proficient orthographic mapping skills. Because when students can orthographically map words or form those pathways, they have that capacity to quickly and reliably add new words to their sight vocabulary and increase their opportunities to potentially lead to better comprehension in the end. So as they read, that sight word vocabulary is going to increase, and they'll start to recognize almost all of those words in a given passage. So you might be most familiar with the reading rate portion in the context of an oral reading fluency assessment. For us in DIBELS 8 right now, that's called ORF, and that measures the number of words correct per minute. So researchers do agree that ORF is an excellent early predictor of later reading difficulties, and some correlations between ORF in first grade and silent reading comprehension in third grade are as high as 0.91, which is really high. Oftentimes, reading comprehension difficulties are linked to that weak word recognition or automatic reading of words. So on this quote on the slide that you see here, it says that reading fluency at or beyond that critical threshold or benchmark is going to enable the reader or give the reader to free up that desk space to focus on meaning instead of decoding the words. It's always our goal. All right, we'll end with the third component, which is prosody. Prosody is otherwise known as expression. It's going to come after students read those words accurately and automatically. Letters defines prosody as the rhythms and the patterns of sounds in spoken language. And researchers have found a strong link between oral reading prosody and general reading achievement. All right, so let's take a second to focus on a little activity involved in prosody. So I'd like for you, I know I can't see your faces right now or hear your voices, but if you'll participate with me at your desk, choose one of the emojis on the screen, maybe how you're feeling right now. All right, and now with that emoji mindset, read the sentence out loud at the top of the screen with that emoji mindset. All right, now try to say the sentence again with a different choice or a different prosody or emoji. All right, think about how your tone or your volume, maybe your emphasis or your phrasing changed. So for example, if you read it as annoyed the first time, you might say, I see what you did. But the second time, if you chose happy, you might say, see what you did. So my tone, my volume, my emphasis, and my phrasing all changed with just that different change of expression. So those are all examples of prosody, otherwise known as expression. All right, when we think about fluency instruction, fluency looks a little different. Instruction looks different than assessment. Fluency instruction should support learners to become truly fluent, not focusing on that speed. Remember, fast reading does not equal fluent reading. So let's take a look at a few activities, fluency practice activities. These can be located if you have a letters manual in volume 1 on pages 296 through 305. Teachers are introduced to a variety of fluency strategies. We're just going to highlight a few of those right here. Alphabetic prosody, the first one on the top left, is going to involve students understanding the use of punctuation marks and what they represent to read alphabetic letters with different prosody. So for example, A has an exclamation point, so you would say A, B, C, etc. Letter naming practice to the right is just like it sounds. It's going to promote reading letter names in a non-ABC order that's going to have both lowercase, uppercase, or a combination of both after students have learned those letter names. Phased cued oral reading is reading a chunk or a phrase. And then to the right, other oral reading activities include simultaneous oral reading, reading with partners, and repeated reading. All of these activities can be completed in various settings, such as independent practice, working in pairs, or whole class. But again, the focus is not on timing. We're going to take a look at a sample lesson using repeated reading on the next slide.
In a book, a lot of the words are unfamiliar to them. And so using repeated reading, they're seeing that same text over and over again. So they're getting more practice with some of the words that they're on. And then when they can read it out loud to me, we can start working on their expression. I noticed there are a lot of questions in your book. When you ask a question, what does your voice sound like?
No,
When you ask a question, at the very end of the sentence, what does your voice sound like?
like a little bit. I'm a little out of the voice.
Yeah, an upper voice. Yeah.
Mhm.
So can you think of another question? Let's read this question and have your upper voice at the end.
Where's that?
Nice. Repeated reading helps them read with expression because they're practicing it over and over again. And then they're reading it out loud, which helps them reflect on that with the teacher as we're reading together.
All right, the full video is going to be linked on the Padlet. It's going to include that sample of repeated reading, but also echo reading and reader's theater. So if you'd like to observe additional sample lessons, you can take a look at the full video linked on the Padlet. All right, so now let's talk about fluency assessment. Fluency assessment, researchers agree that an assessment of reading fluency provides a good overall estimate of a student's reading proficiency, especially in the elementary grades, and is that strong predictor of reading comprehension success. So our current statewide universal screener DIBELS 8 includes a few measures of fluency. Each of these measures are timed for a minute. It is an assessment. A letter naming fluency is going to be assessed in kindergarten and first grade. It's going to measure that automaticity of letter naming. Nonsense word fluency is going to be assessed in grades K-3, and it will measure the automaticity of letter sounds and also automaticity of decoding. And then oral reading fluency is going to be measuring fluency of reading, and that is after students read an on-grade level passage for a minute, they're going to receive that score for the words correct and then accuracy percentage. Both of those scores are going to be critical to analyze and both equally important. As we've mentioned, there's sometimes that misunderstanding of the role of fluency. It's where one is more is not better. That 50th percentile is more than adequate for students to demonstrate sufficient fluency to support comprehension. And teachers can actually view a DIBELS percentile for each assessment within their teacher platform by turning percentiles on that teacher report view. As we wrap up fluency, there are just a few important points we'd like for you guys to remember. First of all, for students to read accurately, they must have those underlying foundational skills needed to mastery. Think back to that visual of Scarborough's reading rope. Also, oral reading fluency, ORF, is going to be an excellent predictor of later reading difficulties. It's very important to analyze those scores. Automaticity is going to occur when a skill is performed so easily that it's done without conscious attention. And last of all, fluency does not mean fast reading. So I'm going to turn it over to Angela now. She's going to discuss our final Big Five component, which is comprehension.
Thank you, Candace. I appreciate your introduction here and the great information on fluency. We wanted to include comprehension as well for today. We know the end of the year is coming quickly, and so with time, it was better to get it all together for you so you're not having to come back in the hubbub of the end of the year. So we're going to talk through comprehension looking at the key components, comprehension instruction, and we're going to have a little discussion about assessment. So to start, we're going to do a little bit of interaction and we're going to do a waterfall. And if you've been with us before, we've done this where you're going to put your answer in the chat box. And then when I say go, everybody's going to hit enter at the same time. So your first question to think about, or your first statement, is a true-false statement. Word recognition impacts comprehension. So is that true or false? Put your answer in the chat. Don't hit enter yet. Wait just a minute. All right, everybody go. Look at all those truths. Yes, very good. You got it. Excellent. That's so fun to watch come through. Yeah, so it is true. We know that word recognition really does impact our ability to comprehend. They work together. Okay, number 2 is the statement, strategy instruction for comprehension is more important than knowledge building. So think about that. True or false, put it in the chat box, wait until go, and then we'll jump in. So strategy instruction for comprehension is more important than knowledge building. Oh, look at all those falses. Excellent. You are correct. It is false. It's not a competition between the two. It's really about the synergy and how they build on each other. Great. All right, number 3. Reading comprehension is automatic when fluency is strong. Is that true or false? Okay, I'm seeing mostly falses and then a couple trues trickle in, mostly falses. Okay, and the answer is false, right? It's not that reading comprehension is not going to be automatic when fluency is strong. There is a correlation between fluency and comprehension, but it doesn't automatically mean students will comprehend. So we need, again, to be teaching both the fluency and also the comprehension pieces. Okay, number 4. Comprehension instruction starts early, even in pre-K and kindergarten. Think about this one. Aha, true. I saw a bunch of exclamation points flip by real fast. Absolutely, that is true. You are right. We do not want to wait to teach students about comprehension, or we don't want to wait on comprehension. We want to be supporting background knowledge and vocabulary and the effectiveness of read alouds, and how the more we're reading aloud to our students and having conversations about what they're reading, we're really helping them build what they need so that as they become readers themselves, they're able to comprehend. Excellent. Okay, so let's talk about the key components of comprehension, and we're going to start with some definitions. So first thing I would like you to do is grab a little sticky note or a piece of paper and just jot down, what is your definition of comprehension? How would you define comprehension? Give yourself maybe 15 seconds, 30 seconds to think about how would you define reading comprehension. Okay, now, I feel like that was about 30 seconds. Now I want you to compare what you wrote down with the following definitions. These definitions come from Letters, Volume 2, Unit 6. So the first one is reading comprehension is thinking guided by print. And this is a really interesting way to consider comprehension. As I read, I'm thinking about the words, therefore my thinking is guided by what I'm reading, right? It's very philosophical way of kind of thinking about that, but thinking guided by print. Okay, the next one is a process, not a product, through which the reader draws meaning from the text. In here, we notice the word process in contrast to a product, and we're going to dig a lot deeper into those two concepts today, so you'll be able to walk away with a stronger understanding of what is a process and what is the product. Okay, and then the last one is the process of simultaneously extracting and constructing meaning through interaction and involvement with written language. So this goes even deeper and thinking about the process and how we take out meaning from text, and then how we then have to build our own understanding of what we were taking out of the text. So looking at what you wrote, how did these compare? Were they close? Have you just finished your letters and you knew these definitions exactly and you had them written down? What I take away personally is just the complexity of comprehension. Reading comprehension is not something that just automatically happens. It's not that we teach kids to read and then they are immediately comprehending everything. There's just so many pieces that come together. So we're going to spend this section really breaking down comprehension even further and talk about all the pieces that go together with that. So we're going to start with our simple view of reading. So sometimes when we think about the simple view or just the process of learning to read, we confuse language comprehension with reading comprehension. And we think of reading comprehension as one of the factors, and really it's the outcome. What we need both the ability to decode, our decoding skills, and our language comprehension skills, our ability to apply language while we're reading. And the reciprocal relationship results in reading comprehension. So a final piece to notice is, we talked about fluency earlier today, is how does fluency impact the whole process? We're not just looking at fluency in terms of reading rate, as Candace had mentioned before. It's all the pieces that go together with fluency, but fluency also impacts decoding. And think about how fluent your students are in being able to retrieve. So we talked a long time ago about orthographic mapping, right? How quickly can we retrieve a word that we were able to process and store in our memory? All of that is part of fluency. The ability for students to recall letter names and letter sounds, that's part of fluency. So fluency is a piece of the simple view of reading as it goes across the whole process. It's not just how quickly can we read words, it's being able to do it with expression, which relies on our language comprehension. And we'll talk more about this as we go a little further too. So when we think about the simple view, it shows both decoding and language comprehension are equally important to comprehend what was read. So developing language comprehension skills in the early grades lays the foundation for success later on. In the early grades, teachers address comprehension through oral language instruction and direct teaching and text reading. Once students leave third grade, the language comprehension strands of the rope become more and more important for skilled reading. So we don't want to just say all we're going to do is decoding. We really want to think about oral language in those earlier grades and how are we building our students' vocabularies and their content knowledge and background knowledge around all of this work, so that when they are becoming more fluent readers, they're able to do that more themselves. So to address language comprehension means we need to understand the process of comprehension versus products. So we're going to think of an illustration outside of literacy to kind of think about what is the difference between processes and products. So painting with watercolors requires understanding how to actually use watercolors. If you have more paint and less water, the colors are going to be brighter. If you have more water and less paint, then the colors are more muted or duller. When you're choosing your brushes or the strokes, you can change how you're creating the picture. So you have control as an artist, knowing all the pieces and how they all come together to create the painting that you're trying to create in your mind. So after learning the basics, a painter goes through the process of painting, which is putting all the skills they've learned together onto the canvas and connecting it to their vision. As they paint and see their painting progress, they process whether it's turning out how they want it to, and they can make adjustments if it's not. The product is the actual painting. So an art teacher does not teach the art student to make the product. The art teacher teaches how to make the paint strokes, how to choose colors and the brushes, how to highlight or make shadows and generate a vision, all of which are the painting process. The skilled artist then puts all of these together to create the painting, which becomes the product. So we can say processes are inferred because there is an outcome or product that shows how well that process went. So the process is not something we can visually see, but the product is what we can see. So we know that somebody has gone through the process when they're able to create the product or the painting. The same thing is concept goes with reading comprehension. A reader goes through the processes internally to understand what they're reading. We can't actually see this happening in their mind. Unlike watching a painter, we can see them switch brushes and colors and make those kind of decisions. We can't watch that happen in a reader's mind. But the product in a reader is that they can produce the knowledge of what was understood. So in this way, as a teacher reads, they also model how they are thinking. The mental model in their mind, inferencing, and so on. By teaching the process of comprehension, students will be able to produce comprehension products. As teachers, we really want to focus on teaching the process of comprehension and not just the product, like answering questions. So we're going to talk a bit more about how this all comes together, specifically with reading. So here we are looking at the typical process of reading and understanding. So you can see the book, you see the brain is reading the words on the book, and then there's an outcome, right? So the hand is signaling an outcome. As the students reads, they use their foundational reading skills to decode the words, their language comprehension skills to attach meaning to what they're reading, and then they use their expressive language to be able to create that product. And our comprehension products are things like writing answers to questions, maybe sequencing the events of a story, or making an outline. These are the physical outcomes that teachers can see to tell if the student actually understood what they read. But in order to create these products, students have to use comprehension processes in their minds. So to support reading comprehension, teachers need to teach students to monitor whether or not they understand what they're reading, to notice the pace and think about the purpose of why they are reading, to be able to make inferences as they're going along and reading, to connect ideas from their own experiences and within the text, and also to construct the mental model of the text. So the teacher's role in all of this is to instruct and model the processes they go through while internally reading. This is a shift from focusing on products to deepening understanding of the text through the process of reading. So all of these pieces are really important, but we're going to focus on that last one of constructing a mental model of the text. And we're going to do that, here. Okay, so if you've gone through letters, you may have seen this model before. This graphic was developed by Carol Tolman. She's one of the authors of Letters, and it was introduced in Unit 6 of Letters. So before we get into this model here, we want to actually unpack some of the vocabulary words just to make sure we have a little background knowledge ourselves on how all this comes together. So let's start with a mental model. A mental model is the entire process that we're going to talk about. It's a representation of the text's meaning that's derived from the words, the phrases, and the sentences in a text. Your surface code, if you see that on the side above the book, are the words and the sentences that are written on the page, where text base is the meaning of those words. So sometimes the meaning is really straightforward. The dog chased the cat outside. And then sometimes the meaning is more complex. Outside, it is raining cats and dogs. So they have to be able to know both of those pieces. And then we look at working memory, which is the process of remembering something and adding it to your short-term memory. And then long-term memory, which are the thoughts and the knowledge that you already have stored and just the knowledge that you generally have. So all of these pieces work together to create the mental model. That is the goal. So as you can see here, the student's ability to create a mental model is the ultimate goal of instruction and comprehension. So I'm going to say that one more time because I think sometimes we get stuck into thinking about, like, can we answer questions? Can we make inferences? But the goal of comprehension and instruction is for students to be able to create this mental model in their mind of what they're reading, which is putting all the pieces together. The mental model happens inside the mind, so it's invisible and it can't be seen. Both the surface code, which is the words on the page, and the text space, which is that meaning part, activate both your working memory, excuse me, and long-term memory to construct your mental model. So to comprehend, readers have to integrate the surface code, the text space, with their own background knowledge, understanding of the text, and the goals of reading. That's a lot. So it's important to understand that this is not a model for a product students will create. This is the invisible process that students are going through to understand the text. The teacher's role is really to prepare to teach a text so they can support this process to happen. They can support a student to create their mental model. Okay, so this is very theoretical, and sometimes it is helpful to have an actual example. So we're gonna take be thinking about this image in your head, and we're gonna actually construct a mental model. I am going to read a short passage, and I want you to think about what I'm reading. So what is actually happening in your mind while I read this? She glided down the court with a defender trailing behind her. Crossing back and forth with her eyes on the prize, she moved closer to the foul line. A teammate set the pick, and off she went to the basket. The crowd roared. 2 points for the home team. Okay, so if you are familiar with the sport of basketball, this scenario probably immediately activated your prior knowledge and reminded you of an experience you've either participated in or watched on television. If you're not familiar with sports or basketball, like myself, your mental model may have been very different. So the first time I was reading it, I was not really sure glided down the court. I was thinking about, well, which kind of a court, and kept going to kind of learn about that, or to try to figure out what sport this really is talking about. So as a teacher, you are really preparing the lesson so that you can support your students to build this mental model to be able to understand the text. So as a teacher, I want to model what the words are telling us and what we should be thinking in our mind to create this mental model. So if we think about these ideas behind the words in the text, we know that a child is dribbling down the court to shoot a basket in a basketball. She scores at the end and the crowd gets excited. So in that mental model, I started with glided, which means she's moving smoothly. So if I'm the teacher, I'm talking my students through this. I'm helping them create this mental model. She glided down the court with a defender trailing behind her. So I'm thinking, okay, glided, she's moving smoothly. Court, well, what kind of court? Is it basketball, tennis, volleyball? All of those have different courts. So then I read defender and I think, okay, well, defenders are in basketball. There's not a defender in volleyball, in tennis. So I would then kind of switch to basketball. So as a teacher, I'm talking my students through some of these processes so that they're then able to realize what the story is actually telling us. Okay, so all of that is happening to get to that skilled reading. So we come back to this model, to Scarborough's reading rope, to show that comprehension is so complex. Hollis Scarborough's rope breaks the skilled reading process down into language comprehension and word recognition skills. Each strand of the reading rope involves different and unique skills that are vital for skilled reading. When any of these strands are underdeveloped, then reading comprehension can be impacted, and we're not going to understand as well as we could have. So if we overlap Scarborough's reading rope with a simple view of reading, we can see that in both cases, the factors of the equation, or the strands of the rope, must come together to build that skilled reading and reading comprehension to be able to get to our outcomes so that students are comprehending and understanding what they've read. So let's zoom in a little bit into Scarborough's reading rope further. You notice the words increasingly strategic and increasingly automatic. And maybe you haven't thought through this part before, but this really applies when we get to comprehension. When we talk about the connection between fluency and comprehension, it's really this part. As decoding becomes more automatic and using language comprehension skills become more strategic, the student is able to make meaning of what they're reading. So meaning is largely the product of effortless and automated activities across all of the strands of the reading rope that we were just looking at. As teachers, when we begin to prepare lessons, we need to make sure that all of those pieces of the rope are included and we're not overlooking something, thinking we're just getting to that comprehension piece. So what does that actually look like? What does comprehension instruction look like? It should address the language and cognitive skills that support comprehension. Background knowledge and vocabulary building, as well as the other sub-skills that are part of language comprehension side of the reading rope, should be part of the overall instruction in every classroom. In addition, comprehension processes should be explicitly taught. We teach comprehension processes through explicitly teaching reading comprehension strategies. So we're going to discuss some of the strategies that we know have the most support from research. With all the skills impacting comprehension, what does instruction look like? Well, the National Reading Panel identified 8 strategies that have sufficient research to support their use throughout the elementary grades. With teaching these strategies, we want to keep in mind that evidence is strongest in grades 4 and up for the effectiveness of strategy instruction. So students in 3rd grade and below, they're really still learning how to decode. So we want to spend more time with them building that background knowledge and the vocabulary, modeling, and working them through language comprehension pieces. But once we hit about 4th grade, we can start focusing more on some of these strategies to help them understand what they're reading. We also know that limited practice with the strategy is enough to be effective. We don't need to overteach the strategy, but we want to practice the strategy and use it with the content that we're trying to teach. We also know that students benefit the most from instruction in a strategy are the ones who are good decoders. And we know that we don't want to spend too much time with students who are not able to decode yet, trying to just teach them the strategy. So if the right students to learn the strategies would be the ones who are able to decode, but may not already know the strategy yet. And the final thing is, according to Shanahan in 2010 and his colleagues, they did some research and they found that the best idea is really to teach the most supported strategies briefly to students who are ready for them in the context of the lessons, with the larger focus as being on teaching the content. So we want to use the strategies that are here, all of these that have been listed, which have research behind them and are useful, but we really want the focus to still be on the content. We're using the strategy, but it's to teach the content. So that's part of the piece to try to keep in mind as you're creating your lessons for comprehension. So how did Letters work through all of this? Well, they created the comprehension planning checklist, and they have the checklist that goes before reading, during reading, and after reading. So we're going to walk through those steps now. When you think about planning a comprehension lesson, the role of the teacher is to guide thinking of the students before the reading, during the reading, and after, so that our students can build that mental model. Remember, that's the goal, really. It is important to understand that a complex text that one might choose to teach comprehension will most likely need to be read more than one time. Each time you read it, you want to have a different purpose for rereading that text. The ultimate purpose is so that our students can create that mental model. And honestly, we want them to own that information. So it's about creating the mental model, but to the point that they're able to then own that information, store that information, make connections to themselves with what they're reading. A good idea is to read texts at least 3 times, and 3 times is a good number. Over 3 days in a row, if possible. So if we did one on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, but each time you're going to do that, you're going to change the purpose of why you're doing that read aloud. So this can also shift depending on the text, also shift depending on the age of the students, the class. So as teachers, you can use your judgment on what works best for your students, and also how many times you need to reread that text with your class so that they have created that mental model of what they're reading and listening to. So we're going to look at our comprehension planning checklist from Letters. This goes in depth in units 6 and 7 in Letters. So we are going to start with the before reading section. So the first step is to establish a purpose for reading. For example, why is this text written? What is it about? What enduring understandings should be gained from the text? We want students to know and understand this, so we would use very plain, explicit, simple language for our students to understand why or what is the purpose of this. Then we want our teachers to identify our genre or text structure, so explaining text structure and what the story will be about in a student-friendly language. And this is a great place for a graphic organizer to kind of help show students the connections here. Then teachers will plan for how they will provide or activate background knowledge. So previewing the illustrations or the text, or building some essential knowledge that students need across to access the text. So let's say if we're reading a story that took place in the 1800s, having a video, a very short video, or showing some pictures of what life was like then is helpful to help prepare some of that background knowledge. And then we want to make sure we have vocabulary. We've specifically pulled out vocabulary that is meaningful to the text, and that we can explicitly teach to our students. So the vocabulary that you select for your text is really just going to depend on your students. It's going to depend on the text that you're using, and what your students' abilities are and prior knowledge of that topic. When we think about those tiers for vocabulary that we talked about, I think in the last session, tier 2 words are the ones that we want to make sure we are explicitly teaching, in doing that ahead of time before we get to them in the story. And then finally, and this part is often overlooked, what are some phrases or challenging language that students are going to come upon that they might not understand? So are there similes or metaphors that you want to explain to your students before you get into reading the story? So this is the before planning. Okay, then we get into our during reading. What does a teacher do during this? Well, first we're going to plan out our questions and our queries. The goal is to help develop a logical sequence of questions to ask at critical parts so that the students are understanding what's going on as it's happening in the story. So they may choose to use sticky notes just to kind of mark what your questions are or the queries you're going to ask your students to be thinking about. And also consider some of the questions that the student might have as they're reading. And then the second step is to organize thinking around the text structure. So teachers could consider using a graphic organizer that fits the structure of the text. So you might use a story frame for fiction texts so that students can see all those specific story elements and keep up with the characters and all of the setting and the story and the problem and all those pieces as you're going along. Then we get to after reading. What do we want to do after is we want to start evaluating if the purpose of reading was achieved and how prior knowledge may or may not have changed from the reading or listening. So first, did we achieve that purpose we were setting out for at the very beginning? And then how did our students' thinking shift as we went along with our story for the day? And then the second part is thinking about assessment. And in not talking about test questions or answering test questions, but really, can your students express the big ideas from the reading? And are they able to explain parts of the story that support that? What's the text evidence that helps them see what they're thinking is correct? When we think about planning for comprehension, we're not just reading and asking questions, but we're really supporting students to create a mental model by planning the work before, during, and after reading. Okay, I have done a lot of talking, so let's have a moment for you all to engage with us. And having just gone through pretty briefly the comprehension planning checklist, what section of the comprehension planning checklist do you anticipate as the biggest challenge for teachers? Okay, so we had a few answers, and it looks like most everyone who answered said planning for questions and queries. Yeah, thinking about the query portion of this, not just asking questions, but getting kids to think about the why and how they know and what is the story really trying to tell us. That's a big piece of how we do this. And my daughter's in third grade, and so we read every night, and I'll ask her questions. So we'll read something together, and then I'll ask her to not just say what happened, but what do you think that really means? Or how do you think this character is feeling? Why do you think they did that? Just to get her to really think more deeply about what the story is telling us, and not just to be able to answer some of those questions, but to think very deeply about the connections. And then we'll talk about if we've ever done things like that and how they connect together. But that query piece is harder to do in the moment. You want to do it ahead of time where we've actually planned it out. Okay, so let's go to a model lesson. Now, I'm really excited to share this because in the Volume 2, Unit 7 PLC Support Guide for Letters, a team of DPI consultants created this model lesson for a snowy day using the comprehension planning checklist. So this one lesson or this one story has 3 lessons laid out. They went through each section of what we just talked about and wrote out when and where you'll do it. So you'll notice some of the comprehension checklist is completed for day 1. Another couple sections might be on day 2, and then different sections on day 3, because again, that purpose, why we're reading it more than once, is going to change based on the day. So this gives us a model example. It's in the Padlet as well, so you'll be able to access that there. And then along with this, they created videos. So they actually were working through thinking about how you as teachers or how your teachers could practice going through a reading comprehension checklist in a PLC time. So with a coach, so there's one teacher or one consultant who's acting as the coach for the lesson and practicing the lesson with the teachers. And then they took turns, as maybe one teacher might practice the before part with their colleagues. And so we have a video of that, and then they're just kind of swapping. So these are really great resources that are in the Volume 2 PLC Guide, and they're on pages 11 to 13. So if you are able to take something away, excuse me, if you are able to take something away from today, this is a really good thing. So I would love for you to open the model lesson right now. So I think it was just added to the chat. It should be in there. Yep, here we go. So if you click on that link, which was just added into the chat, and it's also in the Padlet, open up that model lesson and just kind of look at the format, how the columns are organized. You've got day 1, day 2, day 3, and then across how we're looking at the before, during, and after. So all those parts of the comprehension planning checklist as well. So we are going to look at here day 2, and this is part of the queries. So they went through and created 11, I think, but we're just going to watch a small portion of this day 2 section, and you can find, if you scroll down into the during in this model, you'll be able to see how that's happening in the video.
All right, he picked up a handful of snow and another and still another, and he packed it. There's the word. Great listening. He packed it round and firm, and he put the snowball in his pocket. Pretend like you're putting your snowball in your pocket for tomorrow. And then he went into his warm house. All right, let's think about our temperature and our thermometer up here. If he's going in his warm house, what do you guys think? Do you think the temperature is going to go above 32 degrees or below 32 degrees? What do you guys think?
Well, I think it's going to be warmer in your house.
It is warmer.
It's going to go up.
You're right. That temperature is going to go up in our thermometer. He told his mother all about his adventures while she took off his wet socks. Why would his socks be wet?
Remember, he stuck that snowball in his pocket, and it went inside, and it got hot, and it melted, and it got all to his underclothes.
I was thinking, did he take his shoes off and walk in the snow in his socks? But then there'd be snow on his socks.
That's right.
Why would his socks, I don't know. Why would his socks be wet? Cam?
I don't know. Maybe where it's really deep, it got in his boots,
Okay.
and the snow went inside.
We want to have just a small discussion about comprehension assessment. So if you'll go to the next slide, Donna. There is a blog at the very bottom, and there's a link to that. It's also in the Padlet. And, thinking about everything we have learned from letters, everything we know about the science of reading, there are some really great points that Dr. Shanahan made in this literacy blog that are applicable here. So first, we want to keep our focus lesson on the question types than the text itself. So keep thinking about when we're thinking about asking questions, it's not about picking the specific type of question. It's more about what question does the student need to understand the text. That's where we're trying to get to. It's not about make sure I hit inferences, make sure I hit predictions, but it's really to get to that piece of the text. What do I need? What type of question? Make sure that you are continuing to pay attention to vocabulary, fluency, decoding, think of writing, all of those pieces that we talked about on the reading rev that really do impact comprehension. And only assess if you plan to use the information. Oftentimes we assess, but then if we're not actually going to use that to do something, is there something else you can do instead? So can we just ask questions at the end or pull the questions throughout to tell whether or not our students are understanding, not to spend so much time just on assessing? Because what we do know is it's nearly impossible to come up with a comprehension test that can diagnose specific skills performance, because comprehension is the product of how that process went. So what we use in North Carolina is M-Class Dibbles. 8th edition, we're using the Maze assessment. And that is one indicator of progress of comprehension. And then also oral reading fluency is part of a predictor of reading comprehension as well. So those are the two things that we're really relying on mostly in comprehension for North Carolina. And I'm going to turn it over to Candace. for taking us to the next part of our formula.
All right, so we just wrapped up the evidence-based practices. Now we're going to take a quick look at effective implementation. So in our last sessions, we have dug into coaching, professional development, PLC support, and the professional teaching standards. So today we're going to spend some time pulling it all together with district literacy intervention plans, also known as the LIP. So before we move into the literacy intervention plans, we just wanted to highlight where today's topics can be found within volume 1 and 2 of LETRS content. Today's focus areas of fluency and comprehension are going to be found within units 4, 5, 6, and 7. And also, since we've shared these in previous sessions, Office of Early Learning has created self-reflection tools for both fluency and comprehension and all of the Big 5 components. They're all linked in the Padlet. We've highlighted these tools more in depth in our previous sessions, but just for a quick review, these self-reflection tools are designed to support school leaders like you guys and teachers as they reflect on their current instructional practices to determine alignment with the state rollout of LETRS professional learning. So they will be helpful as you determine your next steps for coaching and learning. They'll also provide a way for you to record your professional growth over time, and we hope that you'll find these tools useful and helpful in your districts and schools. But today we're going to highlight the literacy intervention plan. All right, so hopefully you are familiar with your district's literacy intervention plan. We're going to drop a blank literacy intervention plan into the chat bar now. SB 387 in Section 6 requires that no later than October 1st of each year that each LEA submit to DPI a plan for the literacy interventions that they'll offer during the school year, including specific information about reading camps. DPI then reviews each LEA's plan and approves those that provide instruction closely aligned with RTA legislation and around science of reading, and also comply with the literacy instruction standards. So all districts in North Carolina submitted a literacy intervention plan last fall. If you're unfamiliar with your district's literacy intervention plan, if you'll reach out to your RTA point of contact, they'll be able to share this document with you. And the blank document, you can kind of get an outline of what was included within that plan. So not only did LEAs receive specific feedback on each section of their literacy intervention plan, they also received a document that ranked their top 3 specific recommendations. So across the state, some of these common top 3 recommendations included instructional schedules, both the core and intervention included, high quality instructional materials with a defined scope and sequence and alignment to the science of reading, and also recommendations for consideration of consistency between schools within a district. Angela's going to take a second to walk you through an improvement cycle using the district literacy intervention plan and feedback provided.
Thank you, Candace. So thinking about effective implementation and how important that is, we spent a lot of time in the other webinars around that. So we wanted to spend a little more time today on the enabling context. And we're really going to focus on thinking about our teams and using improvement cycles. So when we think about improvement cycles, one common is the PDSA, or Plan, Do, Study, Act. So we're going to walk through this process using our literacy intervention plans, and you all have already started this process. Let's see how. Okay, so the first thing, during the plan, every district created a literacy intervention plan that outlined what instruction students receive in literacy and how it will be implemented. So these plans, as Candace said, were completed by October 1st of 2022. So in your LIP, district leaders developed plans for literacy blocks during core, supplemental, and intensive instruction, and aligned to the science of reading practices, plans for collecting and evaluating student data, and intensifying instruction based on data. So that was the plan part. Then we go to do. So after October, the plans were submitted, they were approved, and your districts are now implementing their literacy intervention plans. So this is the do part. So schools are all in the process of implementing the LIP. So that means schools are working towards using resources that are aligned to the science of reading during core instruction, assessing and progress monitoring students, and providing supplemental or intensive instruction to students who have IRPs. So this is the process that you're all going through now where we're actually doing this. And that takes us to our next step, which is really the study. So how is all of this going in your schools? So think about, we've had since about October to be implementing this. I mean, since the beginning of the year, but specifically the LIP. How is it going? And during study, we want to think about how are we going to review the effectiveness of our LIP and determine if our students are making progress. But we need to ask a few questions like, first, are we doing what we said we would do? And how do we know it's happening? And also, how are our students responding to this? So let's look at a couple resources that we can use to help us with that. So we've used the ELF before, and the ELF is your Administrator's Literacy Framework. We talked about this a little more extensively in some of the previous sessions, but I want you to think about how could the ELF be used as a tool to collect and review your implementation data. So are these things happening? How well are they happening? Maybe we did the ELF if you were on it and at our first session and you did the ELF with your team. Now might be a nice time to go back and do it again to see what kind of progress you're making. And maybe not even the whole thing, but if you're looking at one specific section that you were really focused on, like the universal instruction section. So have we made some progress since the first time we did that at MOI? And we can also use teacher observation data to determine if teachers are implementing our practices with fidelity. When teacher observation data are aggregated, administrators can identify areas of strength and areas to support all teachers with. So thinking about aggregating data, meaning I don't know which teachers are which, but I'm going to look at these specific observation pieces and I'm going to see, oh, we're going to need to work a little more on modeling just across the board with everybody. And so that information just gives me a little something to go by as an administrator on what support I can provide them, maybe at a staff meeting or during PLC time. If your district or school uses a literacy program, you can check to see if they have a specific observation tool, or you can create one that kind of walks through that. And I think we're going to add the ELF in the chat box. So if you don't have access to that, we'll toss that in the chat. Okay, so along with our implementation data, that's the first part. Are we doing what we said we would do? We also want to see how well our students are progressing. So at this point in the year, our MOI data that we just finished in January or February, is a good source of information to determine how well our students are responding to instruction. So your school and district teams typically hold data analysis meetings after the benchmarks. During this meeting, teachers can follow a data analysis meeting protocol. So this isn't the only process you can use, but this is just an example or a sample of one that you could pull from or create from if you wanted to do that. So we're going to put in the chat our data analysis for first grade handout, and that will give you just a model that you're going to see here on the screen so that you can see it a little larger yourself. But we're going to talk through that process. So the first thing in our data dive, so you have those 6 steps. The first thing is first to make sure that our universal data were completed. Do we have enough students to be able to say this is where everyone is? So we typically aim for about 95% completion or more. And we are going to use this model. We're calling it the FONS Elementary School. And they checked their data completion and they had a 96% of their students completing the DIBELS. So these data are ready to be reviewed and analyzed. So now step 2 is to prepare and review the data. And when preparing, the first grade team filtered the data by level and MOI. Then they recorded the first grade data on the data analysis worksheet. That's step 3. So the administrator and the coach went ahead and did all of this ahead of time, these first 3 steps. So that way, when they came together with their teachers during the meeting, they could spend more time analyzing the data and less time having to just transfer some of the data and preparing the data. Step 4, the team discussed the effectiveness of their core instruction. So we're going to do this one together. So let's pretend that we're in first grade at the FONS Elementary School, and we're going to talk a little bit about the data here. When looking at the first grade data, we see that oral reading fluency has the lowest percentage of students at or above benchmark. So if we look at your BOY and your MOY, those percentages are combining the green and the green and the blue, the at or above, to see what percentage of students are at or above benchmark for each of these subskills. So oral reading fluency has the lowest percent, but we know that oral reading fluency is impacted by other foundational skills such as decoding. We also consider that one of the key skills in first grade is to be able to decode words by the end of the year. So this means core instruction should have a heavy focus on decoding instruction for this group of first graders. On the data analysis protocol, you can see here that some of the boxes are bold, some of the items are bolded, and some of the boxes are grayed out. This is a reminder of those key skills that first graders should master. So we really want to have more time for instruction on those key skills and really focus on explicit and systematic phonics instruction. So if you're strapped for time during the PLC, make sure to at least assign goals for those bolded areas. And it's not that we want to skip any of the gray cells or leave them out. We still want to consider sound symbol associations and phonemic awareness, but really they should already be part of their core instruction. And we want that to remain part of core instruction. So to set goals, this team looked at the percentage of students below benchmark and added that to the current percentage of students at benchmark. So I'm talking specifically about oral reading fluency. They looked at that 25%. They went to the yellow, how many students were below benchmark. They added that percentage to the 25%. Then they added typical growth percentage to that. And then they added a little more just to keep the goal ambitious. And that's how they got to 60% at the bottom. So that's how they set that goal for end of year for oral reading fluency. Okay, so now as we are still working through the PDSA cycle, we are now on to ACT. We decide what our next steps should be. If our data are strong and moving in the right direction, we would choose to keep going with the plan. If our data are on the right path, but we're not really shifting fast enough, we could choose to adjust our core instruction and see if that helps make more of a difference. And if students are not progressing and more students continue to fall behind, then we may need to just abandon and choose high quality instructional materials that we know are aligned to the science of reading. After we've decided what we need to do, we'll go back to our plan and make those adjustments. So you are already through the do, and we are going to work through the study and the act. So back at the Fonz Elementary, the team spent some time discussing strategies to adjust core instruction through the lens of the environment, curriculum, and instruction. So they talked about their 120-minute literacy block, and they decided if they are going to focus on decoding more during core, they needed to borrow from the knowledge building and language comprehension side of the literacy block. So they took 20 minutes and added that to their foundational skills block to use the supplemental resources from that program. And that's how they enhanced core. That's how they shifted the core instruction. So they took from some of the language building side, they took that 20 minutes and then they added that to the foundational skills. And then they wrote it out on their LIP. And then finally, our last step is to plan for logistics of implementation. This is really important because there are people who need to know about this plan, people who need to also be part of the planning of this. So they documented their logistics and they also developed a plan to review progress monitoring data so that they could make adjustments if they're realizing what they're doing isn't working, or keep going if they're making the progress that they're looking for. Improvement cycles are best completed with a team. So this whole process wasn't just one person saying, I'm going to do all of this myself. It really is a team who are working together to improve literacy outcomes. One key to following improvement cycles is to use data and determine how you'll measure outcomes and implementation during the planning phase. So when we're planning, it's not just that we're planning the logistics, it's also how are we going to plan to know if what we're doing is working. And that's a key thing to keep in mind when we're coming forward with how we help make change for our students. Then we implement our plan, we review how it went, and make decisions for the next cycle. So using improvement cycles helps build continuous improvement mindsets. And we can model that as leaders which in turn allows our work to remain focused on how to better support teachers to improve reading outcomes. When we take away the feeling of evaluation and that I'm doing something wrong and turn it more into we're all in this together, we're working together as a team, we're supporting each other, then that's really where we're going to see that great change happening. And this leads me to get to introduce a colleague, Lisa Ober. She is the principal of W.R. Odell Elementary School, and she was recently appointed principal in Cabarrus County Schools. Lisa consistently models continuous improvement with her staff and has led her teachers through data dives and discussions. And Lisa was gracious enough to join us today and share some of her experiences as a leader using data and helping teachers to make decisions. So we are very grateful for the wisdom that Lisa will share with us today.
Hi, everyone. Just caveat to start with, I'm not an expert in any way in any of this. I've been really lucky to have Ms. Preston as some guidance here for our district, and I have worked with our district leaders here as we have developed some protocols. Before the protocols came from DPI, we were searching for some ways to guide our data digs. So we kind of developed like a 4-pronged protocol, and I'm just going to go over it with you really quickly. If there's any interest in having access to this afterwards, I can get that to Angela and she can share it with you, okay? So I'm going to try not to read to you. We broke our data analysis protocols into 4 functions: facts, implications and wonderings. Then we broke it into the implication and instructional decision trees, and then our next steps, okay? So when we were looking at the facts part of our data, we had teachers do some individual work time with their class summary. And before they came in, we prepared them to be prepared, okay? They were supposed to have really looked at their own data, analyzed it, looked at individual students so we could work collaboratively when they came together. So when we started, we had individual work time using their class summary, and they looked at questions such as what percentage is at or above benchmark, what measures are a part of the student's composite scores, and how do the individual measures compare to the composite scores? Because, you know, the weighting of the different measures will sometimes paint a false picture. You may have a student who looks proficient in their composite, but then when you dig down into those measures, you see that there are definitely some areas of deficiency there. So that's where we started with our facts, okay? And some of the implications and wonderings, we asked them to look at how did your students who were far below benchmark move? Which students showed the biggest gains or the biggest setbacks? And one question that we really pushed our teachers with, because there tends to be such an emphasis on proficient and non-proficient, is how did we grow the students who were already proficient, and making sure that we're moving that needle there. After they spent some time with that, we got into the goal setting. Teachers are still working to understand that goal setting, and to be perfectly honest, I am too, and, you know, wiggling with the little flags and everything. But it really has helped us with the growth rate to look at how individual students are moving along that continuum, and not just whether they're proficient or non-proficient. After we did our individual time, we got into PLC work time, and we started looking at how our composite scores compared to the grade level colleague scores. And that's something you really have to get comfortable with. That is very sensitive for a lot of teachers, because they really hold those scores very as a reflection of themselves, right? And so just making it a safe place for them to share that. Sometimes I have given out copies of everyone's scores and blacked out everyone's name except for the one teacher that I'm giving it to, so they can still compare their data to other teachers without feeling like they've been called out, you know, about their particular data. But we want them to look at more than just their scores and how they compare, but what foundational skills are the students missing, and how can I address these? And what specific information do I want to have about the individual student needs and struggles? And so sometimes we spend some time just opening their actual data, because it's not just enough to know that nonsense words is not proficient. Is it showing medial vowels? Is it showing consonant clusters? And so just drilling down to that. Then the next thing we look at is the correlation report and how the changes. I love that correlation report and how it groups kids together and shows not just where they are, but how did they move? You may have had 7 students who were in the red at the beginning. 4 of those are in the blue now. 2 of them are in the yellow. One of them are still in the red. So it gives you really concrete feedback on the instructional decisions that you've been making. Then one thing that Cabarrus County did last year that I loved, and it has become a standard practice for us, we have created instructional decision trees where we take the data and we look and decide if a class, not a grade level, but a class needs to work on core or augmented core, okay? Which sounds it's just a fancy way of saying that 70% or more of our kids are below benchmark in a particular class. And so it's not an intervention program. We still have our tier 2s and our tier 3s, but mainly just a way of intentionally building in scaffolding if you have a class that needs a good deal more support than your typical class. In the context of those conversations, we decide what our grade level focus is going to be, and we move on 6-week cycles, okay? So at the beginning of the year, kindergarten, for example, decided that they were going to focus on phonemic segmentation. And that's not to say they weren't doing all the other things, but that was really going to be where they were going to build their house on that phonemic segmentation. And so we did a progress monitoring of every student. And then we built in an instructional protocol. We've been using Heggerty. We love it. And then every 6 weeks, we do another progress monitoring. And we come together and we look at that. It's almost like a benchmark. And we come together and look at it and decide, has it grown? Have we grown? Has it made the progress that we wanted to? If not, then we revise the instructional protocol. If it has, then we move on to the next thing. And for us this past year, it had. So then we decided that we were going to move on to nonsense word fluency and start working on that. So we've been using Heggerty and Letterland and UFly and those kind of things to work on that. But the progress monitoring of all students and not just our non-proficient ones, I think has been like a game changer for us, because you really see the impact of your instruction. So let's see, I just feel like I'm just talking and not really saying anything. Okay, so another thing that we end with when we look at our next steps, who's going to get the instruction? What does success look like for individual students? What's instruction going to look like for each of the literacy areas? Not just our UBD, but how are we focusing on phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, comprehension, all of the major points. And then we end up doing some commitment statements, okay? And the commitment statements, for example, we commit to discussing our ongoing progress in PLCs. We commit to progress monitoring every child. We commit to having a mid-benchmark data review and making tweaks so we have time to recycle again before we get to the benchmark. I hope that was helpful in some way. I feel like I just kind of raced through it, but I'm happy to share any resources with Angela to share with the group if you're interested. Am I good, Angela?
Yes, thank you so much, Lisa. That was incredible. And just to be able to hear the practical ways of doing the thing, oftentimes we talk about, oh, this is the theory or this is the model, but you're talking through this is how you actually did it with your teachers. and their buy-in into making decisions for their own kids and setting the next steps. And also benchmarking between the benchmarks, the progress monitoring for everybody to really see how well is this going. So so grateful for you to join us today.
One other thing I will say, and my NTSS coach is just, she is a rock star, but it has been a mindset change to get away from looking at her as tier 2 and tier 3. And she comes to all of our PLCs, and MTSS starts with core, right? And in particular, that has been a real, it's been a game changer for our building, just having her involved in core instructional decisions. She's leading PD on how to use decodables, and you can't have her. I'm not giving you her name, but she's amazing. That's been a game changer for us. So, yeah.
We would love the resources. So yeah, if you can share them with me, we'll add them to the Padlet, and then everybody here can be able to see some of the ways you've taken what we've been talking about, what you've been learning from letters, and make it really apply to your district. So thank you so much, Lisa, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Yep. All right, so we're going to wrap up here. We are almost done. If I'd love for you to take just a minute and maybe come back and do this, afterwards, but think about if you've been with us since the very beginning of our series, where were you? Where did you start? Where are you now? And where do you want to be? And kind of write out your progress of what you've achieved already. And then think about some steps that you can take to kind of get to that place that you want to be coming up. We are so grateful. Thank you so much for joining us this year. It's been a wonderful experience for us and deep learning for myself, I will say, getting to go even further into all of these areas. We hope that by using the active implementation framework, you were able to make some connections across the science of reading practices, effective implementation, and developing that enabling context. We know that the work is not easy, but it really is important and worthy work. And each one of you play a very important role as leaders and supporters in your school. We know that by working together, all of us, that we can improve literacy outcomes for students. And we're very grateful for the work that you do and your commitment, because we know our North Carolina students are worth it. And we're going to see really great things from them. Okay, you have done it. Check the box. You have finished the webinar series this year. Everything that we've done will be accessible on the Padlet. The videos are there, the resources are there, and we are so grateful for each of you to take time out of your day to join us. And thank you so much for all the work you're doing out in the districts. Bye. Thank you.